There is a version of loneliness that has nothing to do with being unwanted. It is the loneliness of a person who has simply run out of reasons to keep performing closeness. You stop returning certain messages not out of cruelty, but because you no longer have the energy to pretend that surface conversation is nourishment. You stop attending certain gatherings not because you dislike the people in the room, but because something inside you has quietly stopped needing the room at all. And one day you notice that your contact list is full of names you no longer call. And the strange part is that you do not feel the ache you were told you were supposed to feel. Carl Jung would not have called this a failure of connection. He would have called it something far more unsettling. He would have called it the final stage of a psychological process that most people never complete because most people never survive it. This video is not about how to make friends, and it is not about the sadness of losing them. It is about what Jung understood to be true of the rarest personality type in his own model of the psyche. The type built around a dominant inner world so absorbing that the outer world of small talk, group belonging, and constant company eventually becomes unbearable. Jung believed that as this type matures, the number of people around them does not grow. It shrinks deliberately, quietly, until almost nothing remains except what is real. Stay with this, because by the end you may understand that what looks like the end of your social life was never a collapse, it was a completion. Most people are taught to fear this ending. They are told that a life without a wide circle is a life gone wrong, a warning sign, a symptom to be corrected. So when the circle begins to shrink on its own, without any dramatic falling out, without any betrayal to point to, people panic. They assume they have done something wrong or that something is broken in them that needs to be fixed before it is too late. Jung would ask a different question entirely. He would ask, what if nothing broke at all? What if the shrinking is not decay, but the shedding of a structure that was only ever meant to be temporary, a scaffolding built to get you through the years before you were strong enough to stand without it? There is a stage that comes long before this ending, and almost everyone who eventually arrives at solitude passes through it first. It is the stage of trying to belong. You laugh at moments that do not amuse you. You attend events that drain something in you that never quite refills. You keep a rotation of acquaintances, not because they nourish you, but because having them proves that you are not the strange one, not the cold one, not the person who sits alone in a room full of people and feels nothing shift inside. Jung observed that most human beings orient their inner life around the group. He called this the collective psyche, the shared current of belief, behavior, and belonging that most people never step outside of, because stepping outside of it feels like disappearing. For years you may have measured your worth by how many people wanted your company. A full calendar felt like proof that you mattered. Silence felt like evidence that something was wrong with you. This is not weakness. Jung did not see it as weakness. He saw it as the natural condition of a psyche that has not yet discovered its own center. A psyche still borrowing its sense of self from how many people are standing near it. But there is a particular kind of person for whom this borrowed belonging never quite settles, no matter how hard they try to make it fit. Jung mapped the human psyche according to different orientations of psychological energy, and one of these orientations is turned so completely inward that the external world of groups, chatter, and constant presence becomes something closer to noise than nourishment. This is the introverted, intuitive type. The configuration Jung described as the rarest, and in his words, the most misunderstood of all the psychological types he studied. This is not simply introversion in the casual sense people use today. The idea of preferring quiet nights to loud parties. Jung meant something deeper. He meant a person whose primary function is to process the world through inner meaning, inner pattern, and inner symbol, rather than through outer stimulation or outer approval. For this type, being around people is not restful, it is a withdrawal tax. Every hour spent performing sociability is an hour taken directly from the only place this person actually lives, which is inside their own mind. This is where the ordinary experience begins to make sense. You notice the exhaustion long before you had language for it. A dinner with 6 people left you feeling strangely hollow, even though nothing bad happened. A weekend trip with a group of friends left you needing 3 days alone afterward just to feel like yourself again. You assumed something was wrong with you, that you were antisocial, ungrateful, difficult to reach. What you did not realize is that your psyche was simply built to run on a different fuel. Jung would say that you were not rejecting people. You were protecting the only inner world capable of producing anything real in you. Not because you did not care, because caring for this type has always required distance in order to survive. Think of it this way. Picture 2 containers, one wide and shallow, the other narrow and impossibly deep. The wide container can hold a great deal on the surface, dozens of casual acquaintances, a constant rotation of plans, a life that always looks occupied from the outside. The narrow container cannot hold much at the surface at all. It was built for depth, not breadth, and pouring more into it does not make it fuller. It only spills over the edges and floods the person carrying it. For years, you may have tried to force yourself into the shape of the wide container because that was the shape everyone around you seemed to be using. You kept adding names, plans, group chats, invitations, wondering why none of it ever felt like enough. Jung would say that nothing could ever feel like enough because you were pouring outward energy into a vessel that was never built to hold it that way. The narrow container was never empty. It was simply never being filled in the direction it actually needed. This is where the hidden mechanism begins to reveal itself, and it is more uncomfortable than most people expect. The rarest type does not simply prefer solitude the way someone prefers a certain food. Jung described this type as living almost entirely through an unconscious relationship with meaning, symbol, and possibility. While the conscious outer-facing functions remain comparatively undeveloped, in plain terms, the person often struggles to explain themselves in the moment. They feel things with enormous depth internally, yet the words arrive late or not at all, or arrive in a form that sounds strange to people expecting ordinary small talk. Jung noted that this type is frequently misjudged as cold, arrogant, or detached, precisely because their inner processing cannot be translated quickly enough for the pace of ordinary conversation. Not because they do not feel, because what they feel takes a different route to the surface. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being fluent in a language that is not your own. This is close to what the rarest type experiences in every ordinary social exchange. The outer world speaks in quick exchanges, immediate reactions, surface agreement. The inner world of this type speaks in symbol, in long association, in meaning that takes hours or days to fully surface. Every time this person is asked to respond instantly, to summarize what they feel in a single casual sentence at a dinner table, they are being asked to translate a language on the spot that usually takes them a great deal of solitude to even understand themselves. Jung believed this mismatch is precisely why this type is so often accused of being distant during conversation, even while their inner world is more active in that moment than almost anyone else in the room. The distance was never absence. It was translation happening in real time. And translation is exhausting work that most people never notice is being done at all. This misjudgment becomes the seed of a long, slow withdrawal. Across years of being called too intense, too quiet, too strange to keep up with, this type learns a lesson that will eventually define their entire social architecture. They learn that most rooms are not built for the way they process the world, and so they begin doing what Jung would recognize as an act of unconscious self-preservation. They begin selecting silence over performance, depth over frequency, and eventually solitude over almost everyone. Jung's language for the mask people wear to survive social expectation was the persona. He wrote that the persona is what a person appears to be, not what they actually are. For years, this rare type builds a persona designed purely to make the outer world comfortable. They smile through gatherings that leave them empty. They answer casual questions with casual answers, even while an entire second conversation is happening beneath the surface of their mind, one nobody else can hear. This is not deception, it is survival. But every year that persona is worn without rest. It grows heavier until the person carrying it can no longer remember which version of themselves was ever real. This pattern repeats itself across every part of life. And once you begin noticing it, you cannot unsee it. In family settings, this type is often the quiet one at the table, mistaken for having nothing to say, when in reality, they are turning the entire conversation over in a private, wordless place that nobody else is invited into. In friendships, they are the one who cancels last, not from selfishness, but from a depletion they cannot yet name. In romantic relationships, they are often loved for their depth and quietly resented for their distance. Partners mistaking their need for solitude as a lack of devotion when it has always been the opposite. In the workplace, they are frequently the ones who deliver extraordinary insight after long silence, then retreat immediately afterward, unable to sustain the small talk that follows. Jung would say that in every one of these settings, the same pattern is repeating. The world keeps asking for a version of this person that requires constant outward performance, and the psyche keeps quietly refusing. For a long time, most people carrying this type do not resist the pattern. They tolerate it. They override their own exhaustion because the alternative, being seen as difficult or antisocial, feels far more dangerous than the exhaustion itself. This is the part of the story most people never say out loud. You may have spent years accepting invitations you did not want, maintaining friendships that had quietly stopped feeding you, staying in group chats that felt like static in your mind simply because leaving felt like confirming everyone's worst suspicion about you. Jung would call this a form of self-betrayal. The choice to keep performing a version of yourself the collective can tolerate at the cost of the version of yourself that could actually become whole. Not because you were weak, because the fear of confirming that you were strange felt worse than the cost of denying who you actually were. There is always a point where this arrangement breaks. For some, it is a single overwhelming season, work loss, illness, a period so demanding that maintaining social performance simply becomes impossible. And for the first time in years, this type is forced into extended solitude. For others, it happens more slowly, friendship by friendship, as each relationship quietly reveals that it was built on convenience rather than depth. And in the silence that follows, something unexpected happens. Instead of the loneliness they were warned about, they feel something closer to relief. Jung described these moments as the psyche demanding what it has been denied. He believed that when a person ignores their true nature long enough, life itself begins engineering the very conditions required to correct the imbalance, not as punishment, as correction. If something in what has been said so far has already touched a place in you that you rarely let anyone see, leave a single word in the comments. Recognized. Sometimes naming the pattern is the very first act of no longer performing it. This breaking point is where Jung's most important concept for this journey becomes unavoidable, the process he called individuation. Individuation is the long, often uncomfortable process of becoming a distinct whole individual, separate from the collective expectations that shape the early years of a person's identity. For most people, individuation happens gradually and partially. For the rarest type, it tends to happen all at once and violently, because this type has spent so many years overriding their true nature to survive socially that the correction, once it begins, cannot be gentle. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For this type, becoming who they truly are requires an enormous subtraction: fewer friendships, fewer group memberships, fewer performances of belonging. Not because the person becomes incapable of connection, but because the counterfeit versions of connection can no longer be tolerated once the real thing has been glimpsed. This is the part that unsettles people the most, because it does not look like healing from the outside, it looks like disappearing. Old friends notice the distance first, group chats go quiet, invitations are declined more often than accepted. From the outside, this can look like arrogance, like the person believes they have become too good for their old circle. Jung would frame this very differently. He would say that what looks like arrogance is actually the collapse of a decade-long performance. The moment a person stops paying an emotional tax they can no longer afford. The withdrawal is not a judgment against the people being left behind. It is the end of a lifetime spent translating yourself into a language that was never your own. What emerges from this withdrawal is not emptiness, though it can feel that way at first. What emerges is a radically smaller, radically more honest social world. The person no longer maintains friendships out of guilt or habit. They no longer attend gatherings to prove they belong somewhere. They begin asking a question few people ever dare to ask about their relationships. Does this person actually know me? Or do they know the version of me I built so they would stay comfortable? For the rarest type, most relationships fail this question, and so one by one they are released not with cruelty, but with the same quiet finality Jung believed always accompanies real psychological growth. Not a war, a withdrawal. This is where Jung's model becomes almost prophetic in describing what modern people now call the loneliness of highly introspective, intuitive individuals. He never used the word rare casually. Of all the psychological configurations he described, he considered this inward orientation of intuition the most uncommon and also the most likely to be pathologized by a world that equates health with sociability. Jung believed that a person of this type, left to develop naturally, ends their psychological maturation not surrounded by many people, but surrounded by almost none, because almost none were ever truly necessary. The cost of this arrival is real, and Jung never pretended otherwise. There will be relatives who ask why you no longer attend certain gatherings. There will be old friends who quietly stop reaching out once they sense you are no longer available in the way you used to be. There will be moments of genuine ache evenings when the silence in your apartment feels enormous, when you wonder whether you have simply become incapable of connection rather than selective about it. This is the price of individuation, and Jung did not romanticize it. He believed that becoming whole always costs something the ego wishes it did not have to pay. But he also believed that the discomfort of true solitude is fundamentally different from the discomfort of counterfeit belonging. One is the ache of becoming yourself. The other is the slow erosion of never having been yourself at all. There is an old image that captures this difference better than any explanation can. Think of a tree that has spent its entire life growing in the shadow of a much larger structure, bending its branches sideways, stretching thin and strange in search of whatever light it could reach. If that structure is finally removed, the tree does not instantly become healthy. For a while it looks exposed, oddly shaped, uncertain in a light it was never allowed to grow in properly. Only with time does it begin to straighten, growing not toward what was blocking it, but toward what was always waiting above it. The rarest type, once they step out from beneath the constant shade of collective expectation, often look strange to themselves at first, too unfamiliar in a life with fewer people and far more silence. Jung would say, "This strangeness is not evidence of a mistake. It is simply what growth looks like the moment a false shadow is finally removed." If this is starting to sound less like a diagnosis and more like a description of your own life, subscribe to this channel now, because what comes next explains why the ending of your social life may actually be the most honest thing that has ever happened to you. There is a particular quiet that settles into a life built this way, and it is unlike the quiet most people fear. It is not the quiet of exclusion. It is the quiet of no longer needing an audience to know that you exist. Jung believed that once a person completes enough of the individuation process, the constant hunger for outside validation begins to disappear, not because the person no longer values connection, but because their sense of self is no longer dependent on it. The rarest type, once they arrive here, does not need 15 friends to confirm they are likable. They need 1 or 2 people, sometimes none at all, who can meet them in the actual depth where they live. Everyone else becomes optional, not because they are unworthy, but because the psyche has finally stopped mistaking quantity for meaning. What replaces the crowded social calendar is something far stranger to describe a kind of internal companionship. Jung wrote extensively about the relationship a person can build with their own unconscious, describing it almost as an inner marriage, a dialogue between the conscious self and the deeper symbolic material that has always been present but rarely listened to. For the rarest type, once external noise is reduced, this inner relationship becomes vivid in a way it never could while they were busy translating themselves for other people. Ideas arrive with more clarity. Old wounds surface and finally get examined instead of avoided. The imagination, long suppressed to seem normal in group settings, begins operating without apology. People on the outside see someone who has stopped showing up. What is actually happening is someone who has finally started listening. This inward turn also changes the way time itself feels, where a crowded social life once measured its worth in how many plans filled a week. This new, quieter life measures itself in depth rather than density. An entire evening spent alone with a single idea, turning it over slowly until it finally makes sense, begins to feel more valuable than an entire week of scheduled company. Jung noted that people who reach this stage often stop apologizing for their solitude altogether, not out of defiance, but because they no longer experience it as a deficiency, needing an excuse. The quiet stops being something to justify to others and becomes instead simply how a full life now looks from the inside. This is not a permanent renunciation of people, and Jung would resist any interpretation of this stage as anti-social triumph. What remains is not contempt for connection, but an intolerance for its imitation. When this type does form a bond after reaching this stage, it tends to be unusually deep, because it was not formed out of fear of being alone. It was formed because two people recognized something true in each other that did not require performance to sustain. Jung believed that the rarest, most enduring relationships are built exactly this way, not from the desperate need to avoid solitude, but from two individuated people choosing each other freely, with nothing forcing the choice except recognition. This is the part that most people watching from the outside will never understand, and Jung knew they would not. He wrote that the person who has integrated themselves fully often becomes isolated, not because they have failed socially, but because so few others have done the same work required to meet them there. This is the loneliest and most honest part of the entire process. There will be people who call you distant, difficult, changed. What they are actually noticing is that you no longer require their approval to feel complete. And for people who built their identity around being needed, your completeness can feel like rejection. It is not rejection. It is the simple, unavoidable consequence of no longer being willing to disappear into a room in order to be tolerated by it. If a single person in your life has already responded to your growing distance with confusion or resentment, leave the word distance in the comments. You are not imagining what changed between you. You changed, and they are only now noticing. By the time this stage is reached, having very few friends or none at all in the conventional sense is no longer a wound to be healed. It has become, in Jung's language, the outward evidence of a completed inward journey. The rarest personality type was never meant to end their life surrounded by dozens of familiar faces performing closeness at every gathering. Jung believed their psychological purpose was to go inward so completely that the outer world could no longer compete with what they found there. What looks like an empty social calendar from the outside is from the inside often the fullest a person has ever felt. Not because they have given up on people, because they finally stopped mistaking crowded rooms for meaning and quiet ones for failure. This does not mean the ache disappears entirely. There will still be nights when the silence feels heavier than usual, when you wonder whether this quiet life is wisdom or simply isolation dressed up in better language. Jung would tell you that this doubt is not a sign you have gone the wrong way. It is simply the last remaining voice of the old collective self. The part of you trained for years to equate a full room with a full life, still occasionally whispering its old argument. You are allowed to hear that voice without obeying it. The test was never whether the ache disappears completely. The test is whether you return to performing for rooms that were never built to hold you, or whether you stay quietly in the truer and smaller life you have finally built for yourself. There is a difference worth naming clearly here because it is easy to confuse the two. Choosing a smaller life out of fear is not the same as choosing a smaller life out of clarity. Fear withdraws to avoid being hurt again. Clarity withdraws because it has finally seen what was real and what was not and refuses to keep mistaking one for the other. Jung would ask you to check which one is guiding you on the nights the silence feels hardest. If it is fear, there is still work left to do, old wounds still waiting to be faced rather than avoided. But if it is clarity, then the quiet you are sitting in is not a wound at all. It is simply the sound of a life that has finally stopped lying to itself. What Jung ultimately offered the rarest type was not comfort, and it was not the promise of an easier social life. He offered something closer to permission. Permission to stop translating yourself into a version other people find easier to be around. Permission to let relationships end, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. Permission to sit in a quiet apartment on a Friday night without friends beside you and feel not a failure, but a completion. The last stage of a psychological process most people never survive long enough to reach. You did not lose your friends because something is wrong with you. You released them because something inside you finally became too whole to keep performing for rooms that were never yours to begin with. If this describes something you have lived through without ever having the language for it, subscribe to this channel because this is exactly the kind of hidden pattern this space exists to name. And if you are sitting right now in the very silence this video has been describing, and for the first time it does not feel like loneliness but like arrival, leave the word arrival in the comments below. You are not the version of yourself that needed a crowded room to know you were real. You never were. You simply spent years believing the noise instead of trusting the quiet.